Hi, so it's great to see you all today. We're going to have a lecture about Hinduism from Thomas Awad. Thomas reads Asian and Middle Eastern studies at Cambridge, and he's super interested by the Hindu faith. In fact, he's been elected as president of Cambridge University Hindu Cultural Society at just 19. He also has 10 years of Bharat Natyam experience and has built a thorough understanding of the culture and religion. If you think of any questions as talk goes on, then please do write them in the chat box, and we will try to cover our best to cover them at the end. Alternatively, we will leave time at the end of the talk for you to unmute yourself and ask Thomas some questions directly if you so wish. I'll pass it over to you, Thomas.
So, hello everyone, good evening, and thank you very much for joining me today. Namaste, Jai Shri Krishna, Jai Swaminarayan, and Jai Jinendra. I would like to thank Professor Atul Shah, first of all, for helping to organize and everything, his help that he's given to this talk. He's been a great friend and a great mentor to me for many years. So I must first of all thank him. So before I begin, I just wanted to start off by explaining that I'll be dividing this talk into two segments. The first will be focusing on my personal life and experiences with Hindu Dharma, whilst the second will be focusing on gems of Hindu wisdom that I believe are very important and relevant for the modern world, which I have taken from a wide variety of realized spiritual masters. So to start off today's lecture, I wanted to take you right back to where my interest in Hindu Dharma first began. So I was born in Colchester and I grew up in Coggeshall, a small village nearby, not particularly diverse and quite heavily Christian actually. My mum is British and I grew up as initially a Church of England Christian. My dad's half Palestinian and grew up Roman Catholic, so I've had a little bit of diversity in my own family experiences as well. For a large proportion of my childhood, I went to a Church of England church. So it's fair to say that at an early age, my experience of religion and my knowledge of religion was predominantly only Christianity. Religious education in primary school was never really a major part of the curriculum. Most of the time, it focused solely on Christianity. Having heard countless Bible stories, I never really felt very inspired, and I saw religion as being a rather mundane aspect of my life. This was until one afternoon where everything changed for me. I remember sitting on a classroom floor and I saw my teacher come in with a book that I hadn't seen before. It was the story of Rama and Sita. I was so absolutely transfixed by this story in a way that I never had been by anything before. After reading us the story, the teacher went on to explain some beliefs and practices of Hindu Dharma that were more interesting to me than simply anything else I'd ever learnt about in school. I felt absolutely elated and I didn't really know why. As soon as I went home, I told my mum, I announced that I wanted to be a Hindu, which took her by surprise a little bit, to say the least. In the following RE lesson, the teacher read us the story of how Ganapati got his head and the symbolism behind it. This made me even more interested, and I even went home and wrote down the story I had heard and very proudly recounted it to guests of a party my mum had arranged that evening. So from that point onwards, Hinduism was all I wanted to study. I remember asking the leader of the Christian youth club at the church if I could be a Christian and a Hindu, and I only remember keeping the Christian part in there in an attempt not to offend her, although I'm not sure it worked. Although I kept on attending church with my family for a number of years, my studied interest in Hinduism kept on growing. When I went to the back of the church and I found this book, Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, written by the founder Acharya of ISKCON, known as A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. I was very excited to find it there, although to this day, I'm not quite sure how it actually ended up there. And as I was saying, at such a young age, this book was really heavy going. I remember reading it, not really understanding too much. But in the introduction, I remember reading a section that really inspired me. I remember it saying, it doesn't matter what name you call the divine, be it Krishna, Ram, Allah, Christ, or Buddha, for all are facets of the same ultimate reality. This seemed like such a revolutionary concept to me. having learned in church that Christ was the only one and only Son of God. But this idea of religious pluralism resonated with me so much more. The beautiful pictures of Bhagwan Krishna in the book left me in awe, and I remember feeling a huge attraction and affinity to the form of Radha Krishna specifically. Around this time, I'd also started practicing yoga under a teacher who had studied in an ashram in Bihar. She taught me a lot about spirituality and taught me the mantra Om Triambakam Yajamahe, which I love chanting, and I even remember chanting it in public many times, which got me some rather interesting looks. And at that time as well, my neighbor was from Tamil Nadu, and he taught me a lot about Hinduism and India. His daughter did Bharat Natyam, and he knew about my interest in Hinduism. And one day, I decided to go along to one of the Bharat Natyam classes in order to learn more. I was fascinated by the way that ancient Hindu symbolism was expressed through classical dance, and I decided to take it up. And here's a picture of me in a performance I did, I think around 8 or 9 years ago now. I really enjoyed it, was actively involved in shows and performances for over 10, or pretty much almost 10 years now, actually, and I got up to grade 7 standard. But as time went on, I really begged my parents to take me to a mandir, as I really needed to see Hindu Dharma in action, but they were simply unsure where to start. When I was 10 years old, they saw an advertisement in an art fund brochure for a guided tour of the BAPS Shri Swaminarayan Mandir in Neasden, so they knew that this would be the perfect opportunity for me. To those who perhaps are not aware, Bhagavan Swaminarayan was an ascetic and spiritual leader who lived in the 18th and 19th centuries and is regarded by his followers as the incarnation of the Supreme God, or Parabrahman. Although an unparalleled religious leader, Bhagavan Swaminarayan also undertook social reform on a scale that had rarely been seen before, predominantly in the region of Gujarat and Kathiawar. He fought against caste-based discrimination, campaigned for gender equality, and emancipated the poor. His legacy is very much prevalent today and is held dear by the millions of followers of the Swaminarayan Sampradaya, the sect he established all around the world. Though, back to my visit, here's a picture of me and my dad outside the mandir. I was dumbstruck at the sight of the beautiful building upon my arrival and was simply in awe by the time I went inside. After arriving, we went to the Haveli, the hall next door, and had a short talk by a senior mandir volunteer. I remember asking the question, what is Swaminarayan? And this was the first time that I heard about his inspiring life. When a member of the audience asked the man, who is the main god of Hinduism? He simply responded by saying, just God. And I remember being so confused about that answer at the time, although I came to realize he was simply emphasizing that contrary to the popular misunderstanding, Hinduism only truly believes in one supreme God. Following that talk, walking up and seeing the inner sanctum of the mandir was a truly divine experience, and I was simply lost for words. Then the arti began, and I was totally transfixed on the murtis, particularly so on that of Bhagavan Swaminarayan. Despite hearing many Christian religious songs throughout my childhood, none had particularly resonated with me. The artis I had heard on YouTube were much more pleasant to me, but hearing the Swaminarayan arti, especially in person, really touched me in a way that nothing else had before. I truly felt that the murtis were alive with a presence that I had never experienced, and I had never felt like this ever before. After the short service had ended, I went round doing darshan of the murtis, which was a beautiful experience. We then walked over to the restaurant over the road, where I had my very first taste of Sattvic food, another experience completely new to me. We returned back to the gift shop afterwards, where I asked the same volunteer some more questions, and he gave me his details so I could email him more questions from home, which I did many times. I was very sad to leave the mandir that day, but I knew that I would be back sooner or later.
Gravo boosts with 45% less sugar than the average cereal bar. That's a Graze idea.
Yeah, that's better. So as I left the mandir that day, I was so inspired and so moved by what I had heard. And although I knew that I'd be returning back to the mandir again soon, I simply couldn't wait to. As soon as I got back, I typed in the Swaminarayan Arti on YouTube and began learning it by heart, and it wasn't long until I could sing it completely by heart. I was so obsessed with it that I copied it onto a CD and would listen to it aloud every single day. And my parents got very used to hearing it as well. So I first came into contact with East Anglian Indian Association when I visited the exhibition celebrating the 150th anniversary of Swami Vivekananda in Colchester, which I can still remember vividly to this day. Since then, I've become very inspired by the life and work of Swami Vivekananda and Bhagwan Sri Ramakrishna, and have read many of their writings. The exhibition really sticks out in my memory as being one of my first opportunities to experience the wonderful community spirit of the Hindus firsthand. I remember being particularly inspired by the message of practical spirituality and religious pluralism that Sri Ramakrishna preached. Swami Vivekananda, his primary disciple and eventual successor, is often credited as being responsible for first introducing Hinduism to the Western world, having made a groundbreaking speech at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago in 1893, explaining the Hindu concept of God and the soul, basics about its philosophy, and the relationship between Buddhism and Hinduism. Many argue that even today, the legacy of Swami Vivekananda continues to influence how the Western world perceives Hinduism and India as a whole. It seems fitting that this exhibition was one of the first times I was properly introduced to the Hindu teachings and wisdom. But going back to that year, I first attended the Diwali and Ankud celebration in Colchester, where I remember feeling overjoyed by hearing the various bhajans, Swaminarayan Pal and Arti being sung before the murtis, and of course the huge selection of sumptuous food. This was the first opportunity I was properly introduced and interacted with the sadhus from the Neasden Mandir, and I was so inspired and in awe of their way of life. In fact, I was so inspired that I even talked about becoming one at one point, which did alarm my parents slightly, I must admit, although I have since decided that's probably not the route I will be going down. As the years went on, I continued attending these celebrations, as well as the wonderful Navratri celebration in Colchester, which I especially love. I've always been so inspired and enthused to see the efforts of the Hindu community in the UK, and have long admired their sense of perseverance and dedication undertaken amongst them throughout the country. So starting university last year was both a very daunting and very overwhelming experience, especially during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. I made sure to immerse myself within Cambridge Hindu Society as soon as I could. And for me, Cambridge Hindu Society was a safe haven away from the chaos and uncertainty of the strange outside world. They hosted many things, from social events online, and every week they hosted a satsang and arti online on Zoom, which I eventually ended up co-hosting and later taking on in the year. So that was all about my experiences and how my life has been shaped by my interactions with religion and spirituality. But in this section of my talk, I wanted to discuss and expand on some key concepts of the Hindu Shastras that I believe are still very much relevant to today, especially with regard to harmony and religious pluralism, which appears to be decreasing by the day. But before I delve deeper into some of the specifics of Hindu philosophy and the wisdom of various saints, I think it is important to clarify a bit about the origins and the basic universal Hindu beliefs and practices. So for those who perhaps don't know, Hinduism is impossible to define. It is not a religion like the Abrahamic faiths, for example, but rather a collection of religious and spiritual traditions with no known founder or absolute leader. Even the term Hindu itself is not a particularly accurate one and has no basis in the Hindu scriptures. It was the name given by Persian invaders to those who lived beyond the Indus River, known in Persian as Sindhu, which later developed into the term Hindu. The term Hinduism developed much later and came into usage in the English language in around the 18th century, referring to the cultural, philosophical, and religious traditions of India, at that time referring to all faiths who followed Indian religions. Now, the more accurate and traditional way of referring to what is known as Hinduism is Sanatan Dharma, literally meaning the eternal way. Dharma in itself is a very difficult word to define, but it is generally agreed that it means something along the lines of an underlying natural way in underpinning the right and correct social practices and laws. Hinduism is a broad spectrum of belief systems, but there are a few beliefs that are shared by the majority of denominations that consider themselves to be Hindu. These are a belief in karma, the concept that every action has a direct consequence, a belief in punarjanma, or reincarnation, meaning that every soul transmigrates to another form after death, the belief of avatarwad, meaning that the Supreme Being, who is limitless and infinite in his supreme form, makes himself finite and incarnates upon earth in times when dharma has descended into decay. This belief sets Hinduism apart from other Indian religions, such as Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, which do not share this belief. And finally, the practice of murti puja, or the worship of sacred images. Hinduism teaches that God takes divine forms, which are reflected in these murtis. And these murtis themselves are regarded as being a manifestation of God in their own right. But of course, that is not to say that these beliefs are a prerequisite for being a Hindu. It is still perfectly possible to be a Hindu without believing in all of these things. The attraction of the Hindu religion is that it is a very practical and personable religion, advocating that every spiritual aspirant seeks the path and way of practicing that suits themselves. So back to the current situation. It's absolutely no secret that the past year has been incredibly challenging for all of us. As a university student, the past year has certainly been very unique, with almost all of my teaching being over Zoom. Our entire world has been shifted by COVID-19, and communities have moved their way online, just as this one has today. I believe that it is a time more than ever to be grateful for what we have and to be thankful, for so many could never dream of the lives we lead. So I ask, where is the place of spirituality in all of this? To many, spirituality and religion are just things of the past, with little relevance to the modern world and unimportant to their lives. But in my view, there has never been more of a need for spirituality and the presence of dharma within our lives. Now, the world is very sadly full of conflict and division. So many people fail to acknowledge our similarities and choose instead to focus on our differences. But this is something, according to the Shastras, that are just as damaging to our own selves as it is for others. So in this part of the talk, I wanted to draw some inspiration from some great spiritual masters of Hindu Dharma and make some suggestions as to how I believe their wisdom can help us today. The coronavirus pandemic has made us realize that wherever we come from, whatever language we speak, or whatever religion we follow, first and foremost, we are all the same, and we are all just simple human beings. The Hindu Shastras teach this principle of humanitarianism and unity that sadly many have lost the concept of today. The Srimad Bhagavad Gita tells us that we are not this body, we are not this mind, but we are all the Atma, or the Self. In the Gita, Bhagavan Krishna very clearly tells us that the more we associate with the body, and the more we maintain this sense of ego within ourselves, the longer we will stay in samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, preventing us from uniting with Paramatman, or Bhagavan. There is no doubt that attaining this process of Atmanyan, or true knowledge and understanding of the self, is very difficult, especially in the modern age of materialism and attachment. But Hindu Dharma teaches us that with the help of a guru, anything is truly possible. The society we live in creates conditions that make this process very difficult, however. As I've mentioned, our society is grounded in materialism, desire, and attachment. But perhaps more importantly, we live in a tick box society. And what I mean by that is that the world constantly reminds us of our material identities. For example, earlier this year, we all came together to fill in the 2021 census, which is a perfect symbol and representation of the society in which we live. We categorize ourselves by religion, language, race, nationality, and so many other categories. But fundamentally, the scriptures teach us that this is all totally unnecessary. The rishis and munis of India have long taught all these categories are simply material and temporary, and the only true identity we remain is that of the Atma. The Atma is neither male nor female, Hindu nor Muslim, Brahmin or Shudra. The more we begin to understand that the fundamental aspect and essence of every being in the universe and beyond, from humans to animals and even plants, contain the same inherent essence, there is simply nothing left to divide us. Now, a fundamental teaching of Hindu Dharma is that one always requires a guru in order to make spiritual progress. And the guru-shishya, or the student-teacher relationship, is so strong in Hinduism that the guru is regarded as being the closest person to God himself. The Guru Stotram, composed by Vyasji, explains that, saying, Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwaraha, Guru Sakshat Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Meaning, the Guru is Brahma, the Guru is Vishnu, and the Guru is Shiva. That Guru is that Lord Absolute himself. Salutations to that Guru. The Shastras teach us that by associating with a true and genuine Guru, the only way we can attain moksha and traverse the ocean of samsara, this is the only way, as he is the only one who can navigate us through the attachment of the material world. Humankind has become far too keen on dividing itself up, creating conflict and focusing on things that separate us and ignoring the things that unite us. Throughout the ages, the Shastras have taught the unity of mankind and love for all human beings. And this is a virtue that we are all desperately in need of, now perhaps more than ever. The Maha Upanishad gives us the phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, meaning the world is one family, which is a message that is as relevant to today as it has ever been. In the 15th century, the famous Gujarati poet Narsin Mehta wrote the famous bhajan, Vaishnav Janato, describing the qualities of a good Vaishnav, though in a more modern context and literary analysis, it can be explained more broadly interpreted to mean the qualities of a good person in general. This bhajan has always been a favorite of mine and also of Mahatma Gandhi, who is a famous aspirant and, of course, practitioner of Ahimsa or non-violence. I particularly love the very first verse, which I will read for you now, first in Gujarati, then the English translation. Vaishnava janato teni kahiye je, pida parai jane re, para dukke upakare kare toye, mana abhimana naane re. Call those people Vaishnav who feel the pain of others, help those who are in misery, but never let self-conceit enter their mind. I really believe that this is a really important message. And the imagery of somebody who feels the pain of the entire world is such a rare personality who is, very difficult to find in the world of today. Caitanya Mahaprabhu, pictured here, was a saint of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition who lived in Bengal in the 15th century. Caitanya Mahaprabhu preached his love for the divine in the form of Lord Krishna, and was renowned throughout the region for his propagation of the chanting of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, which is, of course, a hugely popular movement today, especially in the Western world. He preached a message of love for both God and humanity, and he used to say that a true devotee of God is he who is humbler than a blade of grass on the street and more tolerant than a tree. But how often can we genuinely claim to put others before ourselves? Our world is ruled by ruthless entrepreneurs and cutthroat business tycoons. Everyone aspires to be the richest, most influential, and most powerful person they can be. But at what cost? Can money truly buy happiness? How can one possibly gain pleasure from exploiting our fellow human beings in order to secure their own position within society? Humility and servitude are rare virtues in the world of today. One virtue that is especially important during these times is seva, or selfless service. During the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen many exemplify the virtue of seva, with many mandirs and other places of worship around the world providing meals to the poor and needy. But seva is not just a virtue for a time of emergency. It is a virtue we should strive to imbibe every minute of every day. Seva has many different meanings for many different people. Seva could perhaps be helping a friend or even a parent, or it could, of course, be doing work for charity. It is said by the scriptures that anything can truly be seva, as long as it is done with prem and bhakti, meaning love and devotion. One saint who truly embodied the virtue of seva was Yoiji Maharaja, regarded by many as the fourth spiritual successor of Bhagwan Swaminarayan. and affectionately known by his followers as Yogi Bappa. He was completely and wholeheartedly dedicated to serving God through his own selfless service, and in his old age, continued to wake up at 4 a.m. and served 300 rotis a day to both sadhus and devotees. Yogi Bappa taught that we should truly strive to respect all and see truth in all, and he used to say, "Maro e saro nei, pana saro e maro," meaning rather than mine is the best should be mine. Yogi Bappa placed a huge emphasis on practical spirituality and taught his followers to be das no das, meaning servant of a servant, pertaining to service to the Guru. Laleshwari was a 14th century female poet who lived in the Kashmir Valley and was an exemplary devotee of Bhagwan Shiv, embodying the purest form of love and devotion for her Ishtadev. She wrote many poems known as lalbaks, and in fact these number over 850. Her poetry encapsulated bhakti and dharma, in which she truly emphasized her love for the divine. One of Laleshwari's poems that I particularly like emphasizes both love for humanity and love for the enormity and the omnipresence of the divine. The poem goes as follows. Shiva lives in many places. He doesn't know Hindu from Muslim. That self that lives in you and others, that's Shiva. Get the message of Shiva. This poem reflects a very fundamental belief of Hindu Dharma, which is that all are truly the same in the eyes of the divine, whatever name one may choose to refer to him, though this is a virtue that appears to have been forgotten and left behind by so many. It is taught that we can approach the ultimate reality in whatever manner we deem as appropriate, and Bhagwan Sri Krishna speaks this truth in the Bhagavad Gita to Arjun in Shloka 21 of chapter 7, which I will now recite for you now. Yo yo yam yam tanum bhakta shraddhayarchitum ichchati tasya chalam shraddham tam eva vidadhamyaham. Meaning, whichever form of a deity any devotee wants to worship with faith, that very firm faith of his I shall strengthen. I really like this shlok because it reminds us that we should never fall into a very common trap, and that is deriving ego from dharma. Dharma should never be a source of ego. The syndrome of my God is better than your God is very common throughout all religious communities and traditions, and one that is completely contrary to Sanatan Dharma. This very truth is sung in the bhajan Raghupati Raghava Rajadam, in the line Ishwara Allah Tero Nam, Sabko Sanmati De Bhagwan, meaning Ishwara and Allah are your names. Bless everyone with equanimity, O Lord. Now, so many saints that are loved and worshipped by Hindus all around the world used to quote similar things, especially Sai Baba of Shirdi, who used to quote Sabka Malik Ik, meaning everyone's master is one. Sai Baba preached a message of love for all humans regardless of their background, and to such an extent that many are even unsure whether he came from a Hindu or Muslim family himself. So what am I trying to say with all of this then? Well, I really just wanted to emphasize that it is so easy to fall into the trap of focusing on what separates humans from each other rather than what unites us, and that for our own sake, as well as that of others, we should strive to do the opposite. Although I have just explained many specific details from the Shastras, the details aren't really what I want you to focus on here. The transcendental interpretations of religious scripture of course offer us spiritual wisdom, but the practical nature of faith is often brushed aside to a large extent. I have found that so many, both members of the older and younger generation, discard religion and spiritual practice as a stale and outdated entity. Despite Hindu Dharma being ancient in nature, I firmly believe that its teachings offer us a timeless escape from the material world. Now, there's simply no denying that one of the greatest issues humanity has faced is climate change. We are experiencing global warming, rampant deforestation, leading to the destruction of natural habitats and increasingly high levels of pollution that are choking our world, just to name a few. And yet, whose fault is this? The answer is, it is no one's fault but our own. For generations now, we have been greedily and selfishly destroying our world, without considering the catastrophic effects of our actions. Hindu Dharma preaches the principle of karma, as I've mentioned already, meaning that every action we have has a direct consequence. And we are witnessing this very principle before our own eyes. Why is that we as humans view the world and its constituents as our property? Who gave us this right? In the Shastras, we find the very important phrase, Ishavasyam idam sarvam, meaning all this is pervaded by the divine. This phrase refers to the omnipresence of the Supreme Being, which is within everything. And Hindu Dharma teaches that there is nowhere, both within or outside the universe, where God is not. But what do we really do with this statement? Well, the Shastras teach that we should regard everything in the universe, both living and non-living, with equal respect and dignity. When viewing everything as having the presence of God, how could we possibly treat it with disrespect and contempt? The fact that mankind has become so engrossed and grounded within his own ego, we have been left in a desperate and destitute situation regarding our world, disregarding any form of respect for other forms of life within our world. In the age of this scientific advancement, there is increasingly more talk of interplanetary travel, namely the exploration of Mars, but it certainly begs the question whether it is wise for mankind to explore venturing other planets when we cannot even care for the one that we own. Well, we don't even own it, but it is the one in which we reside. Another principle that is central to Hindu Dharma, and in my view, the most important virtue in the whole teachings, is Ahimsa, or non-violence. Following on from the concept of Ishavasyam idam sarvam, Hindu Dharma teaches that the virtue of non-violence should be devoutly upheld to all living beings. Although Ahimsa is a core teaching of the Shastras, few can claim to embody and exemplify Ahimsa better than the Jains. Jainism is a tradition I have personally been very touched and deeply inspired by, and it places Ahimsa as a virtue above all others. Jain monks and nuns wear cloths covering their mouths, known as muhpati or mukvastrika, to ensure that they do not inhale any small insects, as well as continuously sweeping the ground before them to ensure that they never tread on any small organisms. The traditional Jain diet is also strictly lacto-vegetarian and devoid of all root vegetables, given that once pulled up, the entire plant dies, and is also likely to harm insects living within the plants. Ahimsa affirms that all living beings are treated with equanimity, not considering humans to be any more or less important than any other beings in the universe. So here on the right, I've included a picture of Bhagwan Mahavir, the 24th Tirthankar, or enlightened spiritual teacher, upon the event of his attainment of nirvana. We see him seated upon a samavasadan, which is a 3-layered circular structure created after a Tirthankar has achieved Keval Jnana, or a state of omniscience, which is a state of becoming aware of everything going on in the universe. Mahavir, like every Tirthankar in this state, is facing the direction of the east, although the Devas, or celestial beings, have replicated him so that he is able to simultaneously face the 3 other directions, in order for humans and animals to be able to hear his sermon in harmony. This beautiful symbolism teaches us a very important message. Whether a god, a human, or an animal, all must be treated the same. And everyone is just as worthy of liberation from the material world as one another. So perhaps you may be wondering why I'm talking about Jainism in a talk about Hinduism. But I actually think that this is a very important point. As I mentioned earlier, the term Hinduism isn't really a particularly accurate or precise term, and doesn't always necessarily refer to one single faith or community. Rather, the Hindu umbrella or family of dharmic faiths can be extended to include Jainism, Sikhism, and Buddhism, as well as the traditions of Sanatan Dharma that I have mentioned already, all sharing a common heritage and a common motherland, India. So now I wanted to discuss a little bit about the misconceptions and misunderstandings about Hinduism that I have observed myself. My experiences and conversations about Hinduism have not always been positive, and I've often been disappointed to see that many misconceptions and misunderstandings continue to be perpetuated throughout British society. I've heard many statements, both from those from non-Hindu backgrounds and those from Hindu backgrounds themselves. And I'm sure these topics will be familiar with many of you yourselves. So I'm sure this is a topic that many people are used to hearing about, and that is the caste system, a topic which is potentially rather taboo and controversial in discussions about Hinduism in public discourse. The caste system, in my eyes, is the phenomenon that is most grossly misunderstood by non-Hindus. In many cases, I believe that colonial views and narratives remain, enforcing the belief that the caste system is an integral part of Hindu Dharma. And caste-based discrimination is a celebrated phenomenon amongst Hindu communities, which is simply couldn't be further from the truth. But in fact, few want to acknowledge that those who have fought against caste-based discrimination most vehemently have in fact been Hindus themselves. But before I go into that, I feel that it is important to discuss a little bit about the background of the caste system and its origins. Unsurprisingly, the word caste isn't actually a word originating from India. It derives from the Portuguese word casta, meaning race or lineage. The caste system finds its origins, very rough origins, in the Varna system, which divides society into 4 categories: Brahmins, priests; Kshatriyas, warrior caste; Vaishyas, merchants; and Shudras, laborers. The Manusmriti, or Codex of Manu, which is essentially a book of moral laws and practices, mentions that society is divided into these 4 categories for the benefit of all. There were also those not included in the system, deemed as avarna, such as the various Adivasi or tribal communities, and the so-called untouchables, who are known by many names such as Dalit and Harijan. Though again, this was never meant in a derogatory or discriminatory manner. It was just they were citizens of ancient India who did not follow the Vedic tradition, and thus essentially had their own customs and a society of their own. The word Varna itself has many individual meanings and usages, though there are 2 main prominent ones. The first is color, whilst the second is veil. Both of these words do not refer to physical things. Varna as color refers to the different aspects or qualities of human nature, whilst Varna as veil alludes to the 4 different ways that the divine self is embodied within human beings. Furthermore, the word Varna originates from the Sanskrit verb root of Vrnoti, meaning to choose. As Varnas were not passed down by birth, and a person was expected to choose their Varna as they came of age. For example, a person could be born to a Kshatriya father and choose to become a Brahmin. The system was never intended and did not operate as a discriminatory one, and taught that every citizen of society had a valuable and necessary contribution to be made. Although over time, this system became corrupted, as is described in the Bhagavad Gita by Sri Krishna, and the system became hereditary and eventually evolved into the caste system, losing its originally intended meaning. Both the Mughals and the British completely manipulated and reshaped this system, which led to the creation of the caste system as we know it today. Attacking the concept of caste is a popular and widespread phenomenon amongst anti-Hindu rhetoric, but it is never acknowledged that the caste system itself does not originate nor have a place in Hindu Dharma in any way, shape, or form. It's no coincidence that the caste system became rampant and enforced during the British rule, as it was simply a strategic advantage as part of their wider divide and rule policy. The caste system is perhaps the best example of how colonialism has attempted to damage and destroy the true meanings of Hindu Dharma. So as I mentioned earlier, few seem to acknowledge that the most ardent fighters against caste-based discrimination have in fact been Hindus. Bhagavan Swaminarayan himself has been praised as being one of the earliest proponents of the anti-caste-based discrimination movement in the modern era, was even praised by many British colonial officials at the time. He was credited as having destroyed the yoke of caste in Gujarat by a British officer in the region at the time. Bhagavan Swaminarayan, lovingly known by his followers as Maharaj, preached equality of all on the basis of the Atma, meaning the true self, and all other qualities were unreal and unimportant. The Western media has continually demonized and focused on the relationship between Hindu communities and the caste system, reflecting the stance that the British took themselves in India, and was merely an attempt to vilify Hindus and Indians and a way to further divide them. Now, I'm not denying, of course, that caste discrimination has been practiced and continues to be a hugely concerning issue amongst certain Hindu communities throughout the world. But what I am saying is that it is nothing more than a stale remnant of colonialism that needs to be dispersed. Now, moving on to another topic, as I've mentioned earlier, I think perhaps the most common misconception about Hinduism is that it has many gods and is a polytheistic belief system. Hinduism is, by no stretch of imagination, a polytheistic religion. Sanatan Dharma affirms the belief of one supreme God, known by many names, such as Brahman, Parabrahman, Purushottam, Bhagavan, and many others, but does not deny the existence of lesser divinities, known as Devs or Devas. The distinction between God and Devs is not dissimilar to the relationship between the God of Christianity and that of angels, though depending on the interpretation, beliefs about God and the individual self significantly differ between sects. Contemporary Hindu beliefs are predominantly influenced by Vedanta, Vedanta meaning literally the end of the Vedas, and this refers to a specific interpretation of the Vedic Shastras as expanded by various specific acharyas, which are highly learned religious scholars. For example, Adi Shankaracharya, pictured here on the left, propagated Advaita Vedanta and concluded from his reading of the scriptures that Atma and Brahman were one, and there is no fundamental difference. The only thing that exists is the primordial, formless, and limitless Brahman. On the other hand, Madhvacharya, pictured here on the right, propagated Dvaita Vedanta, in which he concluded that the Atma and Brahman were eternally separate from each other, and the Brahman of Advaita Vedanta was with form and synonymous to Lord Vishnu, in contrast to the formless Brahman of Advaita Vedanta. Now, these are just two schools of Vedanta. There are various others, and also many schools of Hinduism that don't follow Vedanta at all. So I hope you have enjoyed my little overview of what I believe is important about the Hindu Shastras. Of course, I haven't covered everything, and there are many, many things that, of course, I have not yet learned, and I am yet to master. As ever, and as everyone, I'm sure, I am, of course, a perpetual student, so I, by no stretch of the imagination, am an expert in any of this. And as Sadhguru Jagi Basudev of Isha Foundation likes to say, the first thing I knew was that I know nothing. And I really do feel this, as continuously learning is something that I really do enjoy to do. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to my talk today, and I very much hope you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions at all, please do place them in the chat box, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have. So now Shivani and I will be having a little discussion about some issues and the current state of the Hindu Dharma. So yeah, over to you, Shivani, for the first question of our discussion.
Lovely. Thank you for that super enlightening and interesting talk, Thomas. So as you said, I have a few questions for you. So the first question is, the study of scriptures and reading can be quite heavy going, and many people struggle to find the motivation as there's no direct reward as per se. So what is it that keeps you motivated, and how do you manage to keep up this level of studying alongside a really quite demanding course at Cambridge University?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and actually one that I've been asked quite a lot of times. I think, I mean, there's no denying, I hope it came across from the talk, but that this is both, you know, a personal form of spirituality for myself, but also a huge academic interest. So for me, the thing that really keeps me motivated is that, as I've said before, I know that I am, you know, a very elementary student of religion, of Hindu Dharma. So I think what keeps me mainly driven and motivated is that we really, the more we read into the Shastras and the more things we learn, the more things that we have yet to understand. And I think it's such an interesting world because Hindu Dharma is not actually that well documented in the Western world. And I think it does actually stem from a poor basis that has been, the initial documentation of Hinduism and Hindu Dharma came from missionaries and colonial officials in India. And they often based it against a very Abrahamic narrative, which has left us with many difficult things to deal with. Because when we unpick the word God, for example, in Hinduism, it doesn't necessarily have the same meaning as it does in Abrahamic faiths, which I think can cause a lot of confusion for people. So with things like this, I think I've always been very keen to get to what the true understanding is. And I think the more I learn, the more I just want to continue learning. And although there's no reward, I suppose, on paper, like I can't put it on my LinkedIn profile, for example, I think this is really the examination of life. This is the kind of philosophy that can help us in everything that we do. And that's really what keeps me motivated.
Lovely, great. And the next question is, do you think it's easy to be a Hindu in England?
So that's a really interesting question, because there's a lot to unpick here, really, because in the Western world, it's still very much geared towards, even though Christianity, this country is secular, we have many things that are institutionalized in terms of Christianity. We have many faith schools, the majority of faith schools are Christian, and the national curriculum is very heavily geared towards Christianity. So I think it's difficult, even for Hindu youth, to get to know their faith well themselves personally. And I think another difficulty is, sadly, that Hindu phobia is actually on the rise. I saw the other day that there was a picture of NASA interns who had posted pictures with murtis behind them, and they received so many hate comments and abusive messages underneath them. And this just can't be tolerated, but it has been for so long in the Western world. And sadly, that is remnants of past experiences as well. So I think in terms of that, often people have wanted to fit in for obvious reasons and therefore lost elements of their identity. And I think that's such a huge shame and something that I really don't want to happen anymore. And secondly, following certain sects and spiritual paths can be very difficult to observe in the Western world. For example, following a Sattvic diet. If you were to, go into a cafe and ask them to make you Sattvic food without onion and garlic, or food that has been offered as prasad to God before you consume it, I don't think you'd be lucky to find anybody who would know what the hell you were talking about. So I think things like this are also very, many difficulties presented to young Hindus in the UK. And the Hindu Shastras also they sort of affirm that we should associate with Satsang, meaning good company, or company that influences us in a positive way, as opposed to kusang, who are company that kind of negatively influence us and encourage us to make bad decisions. But in the Western world, how do we really define who is satsang and who is kusang according to the Shastras? Because this isn't really something clear cut that was necessarily able to be navigated in a world that we live in today. So I think it's all about finding a compromise and a middle ground. It's about finding a way to maintain your identity and a way to interact and stay firm within this world, but in the same way, maintain aspects to your identity that are really important. So yeah, that I would say that it is difficult, but it's certainly possible, but it certainly presents its challenges. And I hope in the future it will become easier.
Cool. And how do you distinguish between Hindu culture and Hindu religion?
I think this is a very important point that many people can get confused by themselves, because there is no religion in the world that exists without a culture. Religion is perhaps the black and white picture, and culture is the color that we fill it with. Every religion in the world has this cultural baggage, but I think because Hinduism has existed in the same place for predominantly most of its history, predominantly in the Indian subcontinent, it is very difficult to separate which practices are cultural and which ones are Hindu. It is certainly possible, but the lines get blurred very easily. There aren't many indigenous Hindu communities outside of the subcontinent. One exception is potentially in Bali, where Balinese Hindus practice a form of the religion that is quite distinctive and different from that practiced in the subcontinent. But apart from that, there aren't very many other examples of communities that live outside the subcontinent. So we have practices here, for example, that it's very difficult for us to define whether they're cultural or religious. But for example, many ways we celebrate festivals today, for example, Garba and Navaratri, this isn't something that has a basis in scriptures, but Garba is of course a traditional dance from Gujarat. So it has a cultural element to it while celebrating a religious festival. And I think actually this is part of the interesting discussion really, because I don't think cultural baggage is necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, it does make it much more difficult to actually delve deep into what scriptures are telling us. For example, with something like the caste system, it's very difficult to distinguish the discrepancy between Varna and caste and where it has fallen into decay and everything like this. So I think, yeah, it's very difficult to distinguish. And I think merely because of Hinduism, by definition, isn't really a religion it's not a religion like Islam or Christianity, in that it has a set founder, an absolute leader in some cases, and an overarching scripture, but it is really a family and collection of traditions. So I think with that, it's actually very difficult to define in terms of where the cultural boundary ends and the religious boundary begins.
And what do scriptures say about women's rights?
Yeah, so this is an interesting point we have, because women's rights are actually something that are discussed a lot in the scriptures, in the Manusmriti, and also pretty much every one of the Shastras. We have in the Rig Veda, in fact, there is one section, the Devi Shukta, which actually expounds the Shakti, Adi Shakti, or the primordial feminine divinity of Brahman, which is emphasized as being the origin of everything in the universe and the first progenitor of every form of life. So we have this huge admiration and veneration for the divine feminine in such a way that isn't necessarily influenced and isn't necessarily present in most other religions, actually. And many scholars of Hinduism have actually concluded that the number of devis or goddesses vastly outnumbers the amount of male divinity, which actually is a very, it speaks a lot about how the divine feminine is perceived. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, the Atma, or divine, the self, is devoid of gender and devoid of any other kind of worldly quality. So with this, we have the knowledge that gender, it doesn't exist at a fundamental level, in a transcendental level. There is no such thing as gender. So with that, it's completely nonsensical to discriminate in any way based on gender. But then if we look at practices that have crept into Hinduism throughout the ages, sadly, we have, for example, Sati Self-Emulation, which is when, for those people who are not aware, after a man would die, his wife or widow would then throw herself onto the funeral pyre and kill herself, basically. So, and this was a practice that was never praised by the scriptures, but had crept into Hindu communities for a very long time, and by the 2nd century CE is generally estimated. And this was practiced right up until the modern day, and it was actually only outlawed in India in 1987, which is, quite shocking, actually, I would say. So, here we have these traditions which many, reformers campaigned against. We have Bhagavan Swaminarayan, we have Sri Ramakrishna, we have Keshab Chandra Sen, all of these reformers, great reformers in Hinduism, who campaigned against these practices and said, no, this is not scriptural, this is not Hindu in any way. Hinduism, it claims to abide by Ahimsa, this highest virtue. But how is self-immolation or discrimination against women in any way abiding to this? And that's the important point that we need to remember. So I think, again, when I'm not denying caste-based discrimination exists. I'm not denying that, you know, gender inequality exists within Hinduism and Hindu communities, because it does. But what I am saying is the scriptures, they do preach that all beings should be treated with equanimity. And in that sense, I do think that, you know, women's rights should be talked about in a very positive light when it comes to the scriptures.
Yeah, that was super interesting. And I have a final question from me, and then we'll open questions up to the floor. So the final question is, how is India perceived by the Western world, and where have these attitudes towards India come from?
Yeah, so I think this is, a question that's really very prominent at the moment, because it's interesting to see how I don't actually think national attitudes have changed that much for a long time. Because the way the West views India often, sadly, is not in a positive way. And, you know, if we go all the way back to 1857, to the Indian Mutiny, we can see these attitudes and the seed that was planted during this time. So, you know, I'm not sure how many people have heard of the Thuggy cult, which was basically, you know, there are debates actually whether this even existed in the first place, and whether perhaps this was actually just something the British fabricated in order to further divide Hindu communities. But it was alleged to have been a sort of a tantric Shakta cult of Kali, which kind of performed, you know, barbaric rituals and things like this. And this was really, really focused on by the British, and they really reported a lot on this, and they really, you know, they were pretty much pushing it as being, you know, this is what Hinduism is, this is why we should convert, this is why missionaries are necessary. And this idea of missionary goes back to, you know, this European savior complex all the way back to the 16th century with the Portuguese Inquisition in Goa, where that was kind of the first incident of religious persecution by European colonizers in India. And sadly, the way the West views India today, I don't think, you know, there are still remnants of this colonial inferiority that remain. And although I think Hinduism is pretty much mostly just misunderstood in the West, I do think there is some negative stigma that remains from this time, which I'm very sad to see. And I hope it will be, I hope this will improve over time. But the British education system really doesn't do a very good job in trying to rectify this. Because, you know, if I had just gone by what I'd learned about Hinduism in RE at school, I pretty much wouldn't know anything at all. So, you know, I think that's how it is for most students in this country. If you go and talk about Brahman and Atman to people on the street, they're just not going to know what you're saying. And if you try to explain anything about, you know, more complex philosophical matters, I think this is going to be, you know, very difficult to get across to a wider audience. So I think that actually, what we really need to do is educate, basically. This is the only way to improve, the West's hostility towards India, in a sense of, you know, Hindu phobia needs to be eradicated. It has no place in the 21st century. And this kind of thing needs to be, the West can't have this superiority complex that they always did. The Western world thinks it has all of the answers and disregards anything that is slightly different as being wrong or even backward. And this just simply needs to be abandoned. So I think the key to eradicating this superiority complex is through education.
Yeah, that's amazing. So now we're going to be opening questions up to everybody else. So if you'd like to say your questions in the chat, and then I'll ask Thomas, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, it's completely up to you. But we have some questions from the chat, so I'll just start going through those. So the first one is, have you been inspired by any Hindu gurus today?
So that's a very good question. And yes, as I've said, the BAPS Swaminarayan movement is the kind of my religion that I am most strongly connected to. The Swaminarayan Mandir in Neasden is like a second home for me, and I I really, Swaminarayan sadhana is a very important part of my life, my daily practice. I have a small Ghar Mandir in my room where I offer daily prayers. So yeah, my gurus have been Param Puja Pramukh Swami Maharaj and Param Puja Mahant Swami Maharaj, who are very well known all around the world, who have preached this message of humility and love for all religions and love for all living beings in a way that is so rare to find in the world. And as I was saying of the need for a true guru, I in Hindu scriptures, I truly believe that I have found a true guru in them. So these are the gurus I've been inspired by mostly, but I've read a variety of works by different people. I've been really deeply inspired by other people like Sadhguru from Isha Foundation, also Sri Ravi Shankar from Art of Living, and also by other organizations. Like I've listened to many satsangs by Pujya Rakesh Pai from Srimad Rajchandra Mission, which is a Jain spiritual organization, which is doing some really great work. So I've been inspired by a really large variety. Yeah, that's my answer to that question.
Okay. So the next question we have is the community in Chelmsford and Colchester and many surrounding areas don't have a temple to go to. And the Chelmsford Hindu Society are trying to establish one in the area, but they're facing quite a lot of obstacles in the community. So do you have any suggestions or any advice to help them move forward?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting one because sadly, I know that there is a lot of community politics involved within many communities. And, I'm sure it's no secret that in many instances, the Hindu community is no different. So I think these issues, it's very difficult, even in terms of which god is the main god in this temple. That's really, things like this, they may seem minor, but it actually becomes quite major. And I think there are a lot of obstacles in terms of actually how we can navigate this kind of thing. But I noticed there have been a lot of initiatives in communities with very diverse different communities. They've actually made temples with really kind of non-sectarian temples. I visited the Shri Sanatan Mandir in Wembley, and that has a huge variety of murtis from regional deities in Gujarat, like Kodiyar Ma, for example, and then also Sri Satya Sai Baba, much more modern spiritual teacher and incarnation. So many, Jalaram Bappa, Bhagwan Swaminarayan, like loads of different people. I think this is the way to go forward, really, is to really have a non-sectarian approach, because sectarianism, it really, really damages community spirit. And I think this is something that really needs to be avoided. But on the other, the flip side of this, it is really important to make sure that, we can establish a place of worship that the community are all happy with. So, it does take negotiation, but I mean, I'm slightly unaware of what the actual situation is in terms of what the difficulties are. But yeah, I think really is to take an approach where perhaps compromise needs to be included. But I think finding an approach where you can satisfy the majority of people.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And the next question is, do you have any words of wisdom for children born in Hindu culture in the Western world who are perhaps distracted by our modern day living? How can we refocus our children?
Yeah, so I think this is a very difficult one, because I think for a lot of youth in this country, religion can seem very tedious and very boring. And I actually think a huge part of that is actually a language barrier, because there are not that many resources often available in English for the youth to learn detailed information about Hinduism. And I think often it comes from, a sense of feeling disjointed, of just wanting to get away from that, old and stale practice where people don't want to be involved. But I think, having come from outside and having an insider perspective of what the Hindu community is like, I've really been touched and inspired by this community spirit. And I really, really would urge people to not take this for granted, because I can guarantee one day when you leave home, you go out to university or whatever, you will really appreciate this sense of community that needs to be valued. And I think this is something that we can really take advantage of in so many different ways. So the advice I would give, I think, is that you need to have an open mind. I think you need to have an open mind and make sure that you don't take anything for granted, because I can guarantee that, you think everything's really boring, or you just can't be bothered to get involved. But at the same time, I think you will have regrets later on, and you don't want to have regrets. So I think what I would recommend is, you introduce these things to children at a young age. Not, I'm a big opponent of forcing anything down anyone's throat, but I think, just explaining things about different religions, about different paths and spirituality and these concepts at a young age, so people get used to hearing about it and they have positive experiences with it. Because I think there's nothing worse than having negative experiences that can really put you off and ruin someone's relationship with both community and religion for life. So I would say, definitely don't have a forceful approach. Don't force children to do things they don't want, because they will only do the opposite. Reverse psychology is a real thing. And I think, we really need to be, just giving a very, balanced and individualistic approach to these things, where we encourage our youth to do these things, but not in a way that forces them, so that people are more likely to get on board.
Yeah, I think doing that in a fun and engaging way would help. So like going to Garba whenever you can in your local community, and meeting up with your friends and family in the community as well. If they're doing these activities with their friendship groups and with their peers, they're more likely to get engaged with it. And then our next question is, if there was one scripture you would recommend to read today, what would that be, Thomas?
I think that's really difficult to answer, actually, because, as I've said, Hinduism isn't a faith with, one single book, which actually is able to, you really need to see it from all angles to begin to experience what it actually is. But I would say the Bhagavad Gita is a good starting point, because that really, it's very, very complex. I certainly don't understand a lot of it myself fully, but I think it's really, you need to find a good commentary, and you need to find, possibly even a simplified version. But it really does give a really good overview of what Hinduism and Hindu philosophy. It outlines it very well in a way that is interesting to read as well, because it's written in the style of a dialogue, as the traditional shastras were. So I think this is the key one to read, and it tells us a lot about who God is and who God is in Hinduism. And I think it's, from there we have many other paths where we can go down, but I think that's a good starting point. But there are so many different books where you could start. I would probably advise not to go straight for something like the Rig Veda, because it's predominantly just verses and prayers. You can't actually learn a lot philosophically. But in terms of actually learning and outlining things, I do think that it's actually a very important, a very good starting point. Yeah.
Great. The next one is, what's your opinion on Hinduism not being taught very much in RE, even though it's the third largest religion in the world?
I think it's very poor. It's very bad, because there are pretty much near enough 1 billion Hindus in the world. For example, we look at the way that it's so focused on Christianity, and even Christianity is in decline in this country, but this country still is so persistent on teaching it. It does, tell us quite a lot about the state of society. I think it's a blatant ignoring of a huge sector of the world, because even outside of India, Hinduism had a very pervasive influence in Southeast Asia, through the Chola Empire, through so many, even in China and Japan, we can see a lot of influence from ancient India, for example. It's a huge civilization, and actually one of the oldest living civilizations in the world. And Hinduism is one of the oldest living religions in the world. So apart from missing out on a hugely interesting topic to learn about, I do actually think that it's just blatant ignorance, because in this day and age, with such a large Hindu community in the UK numbering around 1 million, it's just such it's such a stupid thing not to learn about it in school, because it leaves you, with people asking you at university, why do Hindus worship cows, or why do Hindus have millions of different gods, because they've never learned these things in school. So they just have no clue about anything. So I think it's very poor, and I really hope that it changes. Yeah.
And then we have another question, which is similar to a previous question, but if you have anything to add, do let me know. So how can we encourage young Hindus to be proud of their Dharma and culture?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. And I think the advice I would give is, again, don't take for granted what you have. People haven't always been able to freely be a Hindu, and even the basic things like celebrating Diwali, even if you're not religious yourself, were once suppressed under Mughal rule. For example, this kind of thing was not allowed. Hinduism was brutally repressed for a very long time, and under British rule as well, of course. So, we've come to a point where people are allowed to be comfortable and proud of their identity. It's still not perfect. There is still a lot of racism and discrimination in the world, and in Britain for that matter specifically. But what I do think is that it's really important that people do be proud of, what your ancestors have fought for, because, coming thousands of miles across the world is a big thing. It's a big sacrifice, and it's really important to try to maintain your part of your identity. I'm not forcing everybody or to try and become a sannyasin or a renunciant or whatever. But what I'm saying is, it's not, you should never be ashamed or unapologetic to be Hindu, because it's an identity. It's one of the oldest living religions. It's a huge thing to be proud of. And I think that it's such a shame that many people feel insecure and unable to be open and proud of this. But I really hope that that can change. And again, with education, I do believe that can change. But currently, the education situation is very, very much lacking. It's both secular in some parts, and even veering on anti-religion actually, and very much Christian orientated in other parts. So I really hope that this situation can change.
That's amazing. Does anybody want to unmute? Because I think I've been through all the questions in the chat. So if anybody has any final questions, do let me know. Just unmute yourself or ask in the chat. If not, we have lots and lots of compliments to you, Thomas, in the chat, so you can have a little read of those later.
Sorry, I haven't been able to type. It's not possible for me, but I've got a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
In terms of from an education perspective, because I do agree with you that it's a really important starting point in terms of kind of sharing the religion and what's about with children especially. Would you say that it's more important to kind of go in from, because there's that distinction between religion and culture? Would you say culture is a really good starting point, or do you think it should be from the religious perspective, if that makes sense, kind of in terms of starting education with children, with young children in schools?
Yeah, I think the cultural aspect of Hinduism is really is really key, because I think that's actually what gets a lot of people involved in it in the first place, because, you know, that's why there are a lot of people turning up to, you know, Navratri and the Garbas, because it's a really fun and engaging thing to be able to do, perhaps more so than going to a Havan or a Mandir, where, you know, it's actually, you know, really, you can't understand anything they're saying, or you know, it just seems very archaic and just not very interesting. So I think the cultural aspect of it is something that should really be celebrated. And in that sense, I definitely don't think the discrepancy between what is religion and what is culture is actually a really good thing. You know, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because the Hindu culture is so vibrant and so diverse. There's a huge, you know, huge spectrum of what actually encompasses Hindu culture. And I think talking about, you know, Hindus from this region do this Diwali, and Hindus from this region do this during Navratri, for example, is a really interesting point, because, you know, I think Hinduism is unique in the sense that its sects and its denominations are very much regional, and that actually isn't a phenomenon that's very common in a lot of religions worldwide. For example, like Catholicism, it covers a huge region, but for example, like you know, a Hindu from Bengal practice very differently from a Hindu from Kerala, for example, despite even if they worship the same God, simply because of their cultural background. So I think that, you know, it's really important to emphasize the celebration of this cultural identity as well as the religious one, because often the cultural identity is the way that you can then become involved with the religion. And I think that that's, yeah, I'd say that's the best way to approach it, really.
I've got a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Just
sure.
quick feedback. Thanks so much, firstly, for delivering a really, really good talk. I really enjoyed it. It was very articulate. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I've learned so much. So thank you for that.
Oh,
my question would be, you mentioned the census at some point in your talk, and the idea of categories and identities. To what extent do you think it's quite important now for kind of Hindus to maybe use those categories or identity markers to their advantage? Do you feel Hindu thought or Hindu philosophy sometimes overly negates that to the detriment of potential benefits to the Hindu community, which can occur in Britain, for example, you know, government funding and the government understanding that there's a Hindu population and they have certain requirements? So how do you think that balances with some of the philosophies and ideas which maybe negate that? And how do you think maybe Hindus should get more involved, not just in understanding Dharma, but actually perhaps kind of getting involved in activism and actually representing the interests of the larger community within the wider kind of secular framework within which we operate?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And actually, you know, I think because Hinduism is such a tolerant and such a, you know, almost an open religion, really, that can often be to the disadvantage of Hindus. Because Hinduism preaches this pluralism, that then, you know, it can lead to people falling victim to perhaps, you know, like missionaries, or, you know, this kind of sense of taking advantage of this pluralism. Because although it's so important to be pluralistic and seeing truth in all, that shouldn't mean that we shouldn't be proud of the traditions and the practices that are distinctly Hindu and have been preserved for thousands and thousands of years now. So I think in that sense, you don't want to do anything that negates Dharma, but it's very important to be unapologetically Hindu, because, you know, we don't live in an age where it is acceptable and okay for any kind of minority to be silenced. Well, yeah, obviously not in India, a minority, but, you know, any sort of group within society to be, you know, shy or you know, not proud of their identity. So I do think that it is important for Hindus in the UK to become involved in activism. You know, we're seeing NHSF, the National Hindu Student Forum, has been doing some really, really good work in terms of combating Hindu phobia. in the UK. And actually, they focused on this issue being in academia, because, you know, we had an Oxford academic last year kind of gloating about his anti-religious upbringing, and him being, you know, destroying Saraswati murtis, and thinking it was really funny talking about that. So these kind of attitudes need to be challenged, and we can't just let things like this go, because even though many people have taken a, you know, live and let live stance, I think the time has come where people do need to be more involved personally, and they do need to be involved in this kind of, you know, wave of change that needs to happen. And it needs to be, you know, I would like to see a Britain where every single Hindu feels completely comfortable and unapologetic in their identity. And I think sadly that isn't a point where everyone is at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think that's a wrap. Does anyone have any final questions? No, thank you so much, Thomas. That was amazing. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure everybody else did as well. Yeah, thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for coming as well. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've learned lots and lots from this talk. I hope you enjoyed it being from a different perspective as well, because usually, obviously, we get talks from the elders. It's not very often where we get talks from a young person, so that's amazing. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you everyone for coming. Hope you've all enjoyed
Thank you,
it.
Thomas. Thank you. Really enjoyed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
very much.
organizing this wonderful talk.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.